And you heard it here, steal some ideas, don't be shy. In many of our panels throughout the conference, we will hear from more representatives of federal agencies as well, including the Department of Energy, Department of the Interior, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, and the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation on some of the specific work that they are doing to address the climate crisis. So just as the federal government is powerful when its agencies and its efforts are activated to lead on climate, it is just as powerful when leaders in the utility sector, the second largest source of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, pursue an ambitious path to net zero. I'd like to now introduce our next panel, the power sector's transition to net zero. So Lisa Jacobson, president of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, was originally scheduled to moderate this panel. Unfortunately, she will not be able to join us today. So I will instead be moderating and talking with these three incredible leaders from the utility sector about their efforts to decarbonize in the United States by mid-century or earlier, advance equitable access to energy, and to build resilience to climate change. So today, it's my pleasure to introduce Ralph Izzo, Chief Executive Officer of PSEG, Calvin Butler, Chief Operating Officer of Exelon, and Pedro Pizarro, Chief Executive Officer of Edison International. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Thank you. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Hi. So I have some questions for you. I'm looking forward to a robust discussion with you. I want to just kind of set the stage a little bit, which is due to the leadership and the vision of you and your colleagues, the power sector has reduced its carbon emissions by 35% below 2005 levels. And even as the economy rebounded from the initial lockdowns of 2020, the power sector remained below its pre-pandemic emissions level. Now, this is very important progress, but we know that much more must be done to decarbonize the power sector to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And further, significant emissions reductions need to be made in the power sector this decade, so the urgency is very clear, and I'm not telling any of you anything new on that scale. But I'd love to start the conversation, and Ralph, if I might start with you and ask you a few questions. First of all, how is your organization looking at the challenges that the energy industry is facing, and what actions can be taken to address these challenges?
Sure, well, there's no shortage of challenges. I'll focus on the topic of this conference, which is climate change. We've set a net zero target for 2030 for our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. That'll be pretty straightforward to achieve, quite candidly. We'll have to electrify our fleet, eliminate methane emissions from our gas pipe system. We'll have some challenges around line losses associated with just ohmic dissipation of energy on the wires being connected to a power supply in PJM that does have some carbon, but we'll work around that. We've also, this past September, joined the United Nations Race to Zero, the business ambition for 1.5 degrees C. So we have until September of next year to set science-based targets for Scope 1, 2, and 3 to live within that 1.5 degrees C. So our challenge, like many other companies, will be Scope 3, because the G in PSEG is gas. So we'll have to worry about what our customers are doing with that and how to reduce that. So there are 5 tools that we plan to deploy to achieve that. First and foremost is the least often mentioned energy efficiency, which we believe has an outsized role to play and unfortunately is often ignored. Well, not ignored, but not spoken of as much as it should. Second is preservation of our number 1 source of carbon-free energy in the US today, and that's nuclear power. Mm-hmm. Third is investing in carbon-free energy, primarily offshore wind for us, but it could be onshore wind, solar, or new nuclear for others. And as we've reduced the amount of energy that people use through energy efficiency, and as we decarbonize the electric sector, the 4th tool would be to electrify the economy, in particular transportation As you noted, we are now number 2 behind transportation. We can control all of that. The 5th tool is one we don't control and we're just advocating for, which is to get a price on carbon so that which of the 4 tools should be applied where is made under some basis of rational economic decisions. If we do that, we create a vision of the future that says we're going to use less energy. The energy we do use will be cleaner than ever before. And a piece that I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about later on, it will be delivered with unsurpassed resiliency in the face of climate change challenges that are imposed upon the system. So that's sort of big picture how we're addressing the challenges.
Wonderful. So you did mention the UN Race to Zero. So from a global perspective, what do you think that we can do as a country, that we can do in the near term to really help avoid the impacts of climate change? And specifically, how does that policy fit in?
Yeah, so this is the part of the program where I make sure I'm wearing a washable suit or I have something protecting me from the spoiled vegetables that will be thrown at me. You talked about the fact that our industry did a great job of reducing emissions. And there were some terrific things done by my peers and colleagues and others. But the reality is the number 1 tool we had in reducing emissions was the fact that natural gas was inexpensive and replaced coal. And that was driven purely by technology and the availability of the Utica Shale and the Marcellus Shale and the Barnett Shale and various other locations. I am terrified of the fact that the rest of the planet right now, 2 nations in the rest of the planet, are planning to build 600 coal plants just between India and China. And that is just a devastating impact it's going to have on the carbon budget of this planet. I think that one of the things this nation should do is take a chapter out of what we did for ourselves and do so for the rest of the world. So, Amy, you may not want to sit close to me. And that is to export more natural gas and reduce the reliance that these nations will have on coal. It happens to have the ancillary benefit if we're exporting more natural gas of creating perhaps some more geopolitical stability in terms of us being more of a trustworthy and the long-term reliable supplier of that LNG. That doesn't mean that we should turn to use more natural gas here in the United States. We need the climate provisions of the Build Back Better legislation to pass so that we can invest in renewables and we can keep nuclear alive. But I think for the rest of the world, we just want to intercept and interrupt this continued reliance on coal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So bringing back to a smaller scale now, you have customers, and they are a very important part of the puzzle to solve and reduce emissions. So what is the most impactful way that utilities can help the customers contribute to the lowering of emissions at home?
Yeah, so I love taking this poll. I do this all the time, and I've yet to regret doing it. The lights are kind of bright, so I can't see everybody in the audience, but by a show of hands, how many folks woke up this morning and said, I can't wait to use a kilowatt hour? That's typically the response I get. The number 1 thing is energy efficiency. But every one of you has no economic incentive, per se, to do so, right? Because if you're running a hospital, people don't come to your hospital because you're the most efficient energy user in the hospital system. It's because of the quality of your medical care. If you're running a university, they're not coming there because you use fewer BTU per square foot. It's because you have Nobel Prize winning scientists or other scholars. And similarly at the home, that refrigerator, yes, you'd like to get the most efficient one, but if it's hideous looking, you're going to go for the one that's slightly more attractive, and the list goes on and on and on. So utilities pride ourselves on universal access. We pride ourselves on the relationship with the customer, and we have much more information about how the customer uses energy than the customer themselves probably have. Mm-hmm. So that would be by far the number 1 objective, to help our customers have less of an impact on the environment, would be ubiquitous deployment of energy efficiency.
Well, I'm going to come back to you. Thank you for those remarks, Ralph. But I'm going to turn it over to Calvin right now. And Calvin, I'm going to ask you the same question I started with Ralph, which is, how is your organization looking at the challenges that the energy industry is facing, and what actions can be taken to address those challenges?
So well, first off, good afternoon, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you. I just can't say I agree with Ralph. That won't do it? No. I think the first piece is acknowledging that climate change is probably the number 1 issue that we have to address in the very near future. You made reference to the UN report, and I think the UN report said very clearly that with the temperatures rising as they are on our planet, in some near future, it will become inhabitable. And if that's not a wake-up call, I don't know what is. And in all the discussions throughout the day, we have been talking about the ambitious targets and the ambitious goals. But our ambitions, our aspirations aren't matching those efforts, our efforts, right? And we're aspiring for great things, but when you look about all the things that are talking about and what we're doing as a collective, you don't see that same level of activity driving. We're still talking a lot. I love the conversation that was just had about the whole of government, but prior to this, we were still working in silos and so forth. So once we identified and understood that, we then had to sit back and say, and Ralph, and this is where I definitely agree, we had to look internally and say, what are we going to do? So for Exelon, we set out and we said right out the gate, we're going to electrify our fleet. You know, you start looking at those things, what are you doing? And setting targets for us has never been new. This is what we've been doing, you know, for well over a decade. I like to say we were doing this before it was vogue, right? This was kind of what we do to manage our business. And started back in setting a 20% goal of carbon reduction, and was Exelon 2020. We met that goal in 2016. So here we set our goal here to electrify our fleet, 30% by 2025, 50% by 2030. But what's key to that is technology. We have to continue looking for the new technologies to get that done. And I heard Andrew talking about that, you know, the challenges with supply chain and the technology and the like. But then we also set our path to clean. Our path to clean, you know, Exelon, 12% of our portfolio was also natural gas. We ramped up the replacement of our gas infrastructure. It was roughly on about a 50-year plan across. Now, for those of you who don't know Exelon, we're in 6 jurisdictions: Atlantic City, Wilmington, Delaware, Baltimore, giving you the main cities, DC, thank you for those customers, thank you, DC, Philadelphia, and Chicago. So when you look about where we serve, we have 3 LDCs, gas companies, and the replacement plan of that infrastructure was roughly 50 years. We accelerated to get it all replaced, the main within 20. To Ralph's point, that will significantly reduce our greenhouse gases. We also looked at other technology. How are we going to reduce our FS6 breakers? Gas insulator that was leaking methane into the environment. We're working with new technology. But we had to also identify partners and invest in those partners to drive that new technology, because we weren't going to do it alone. In addition to that, I would also sit back and say, that's key. I heard the last comment where don't be afraid to steal some ideas and so forth. I like to think of it as collaboration or partnership, because it's those type of partnerships that are really going to drive this agenda. And we intentionally start putting money into that effort. So over the next decade, we will invest over $4.8 billion in our whole effort to decarbonize. But the efforts with EPRI, the efforts with DOE and Argonne National Labs, just today, our utility in Chicago announced the partnership with the Department of Energy, Argonne National Lab, with EPRI to do a study on climate change of what it does to the region and how increased weather patterns impact the grid. You don't get there on your own. It's that type of level of collaboration that's really going to drive this. So we had to do an internal look and really drive that issue.
Wonderful to hear. I also wanted to ask you about equity and energy. I've heard you talk about it a lot, and it's a very important topic. And so I'd like to ask you a two-pronged question. One is, what are you doing at Exelon to drive diversity, inclusion, and equity? And also, if you could talk about the sector, the energy sector, in terms of what can be achieved there in the bigger picture.
Yeah, thank you for that, because that's very important to me and it's very important to Exelon. I do say that we need to put more energy into our equity and more equity into our energy efforts, because again, I told you about our jurisdictions. 20% of our customers in our jurisdictions are at the federal poverty level, 150% or below. So if we're truly serving our jurisdictions and we're talking about moving this effort and the effort around affordability, you can't ignore the equity efforts. So Exelon has leaned into this. One, if we're going to be a customer-centric organization, you can't ignore it. But then it goes to your customers are going to say, okay, so what are you doing? So we've done a couple of things. First, we've made a significant investment in minority-owned businesses from the communities in which we serve. Because we know for a fact, I had a chance to meet one of those companies here today, where a partnership, where we're sitting back saying, these ideas come from the communities, and over the last decade, we've invested, not in the last decade, from 2016 to 2021, we invested $2.9 billion annually with our minority businesses. And understand, in doing that effort, it's increased 56% over the last 5 years. So we're serious about that. Not only are we doing business with them, we're investing in them. Just a few months ago, we announced our Racial Equity Capital Fund, where we're going to create a fund to invest $36 million with minority-owned businesses in our jurisdictions to help them grow. We've also announced this mentorship program. We've also announced a scholarship program to develop the next level of leaders. But understand that equity is not the same as equality, right? A lot of people get that. Equity is really all about providing resources to achieve an equal result. Recognizing that the resources may be different from person to person or group to group to achieve that. That's equality, that equal result. So you have to understand that some communities may require more because of their starting point. That's equity. So when we sit back and lean in, all the efforts that we're putting around this effort, that is the why, and that's how we've leaned into the discussion.
So you mentioned the starting points, and you've given some really practical projects and things that can be implemented on the ground. But for companies that are listening today, what other pieces of advice do you have for them to get started and to engage their customers or partners and in order to become more active in addressing climate change?
No, that's a great question, because a lot of companies, a lot of partners, a lot of people just don't know where to begin, or they don't want to be looked down upon because they're starting at square one when some people may be, I'll be honest, Ralph and Pedro, they've been in this for a while, and their companies were so much further advanced in some areas. And we had a choice, do we just sit back and say, boy, this is not enough? Ralph talked about net zero by 2030, and I just rolled out our path to clean. We said we're going to achieve it with technology by 2050. So does that say I don't roll out a plan because I'm not as aggressive? No. What it says is that I get involved into the conversation and partner with the communities. So I would sit back and say to any of you who are interested is that you need to make equity at the core of what you do. And it's so much more than diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a broader picture. It's leaning in, because a lot of people say they don't want DEI to take away from all the work that you do. But if all of our communities don't come along with us, we're not going to get there. So I say the equity component, the DEI, is the work. It's core to all of that, because I'll just use DC as an example, since we're sitting right here in the nation's capital. All the efforts that we're doing are inputting to connect distributed energy resources. But if I have a community that home ownership is low, and I don't engage them into the conversation, guess what? We're not really moving the needle. And we're shifting the burden of what we're doing to those who can least afford it. So in Ward 7 here in the district, we implemented a program, a community solar program, where we offer to low to moderate income customers an ability to save on their bills to get those credits. That's equity, because it's a different resource needed, it's a different solution, but it's driving the solutions. So I would say to anyone who's listening is that incorporate it into the work you do and make it foundational, and you will see the results tenfold, because everyone's engaged.
Okay, Thank you so much. Thank you. And Pedro, I'd like to ask you a few questions. So can you describe what Edison International is doing in terms of addressing the challenges that the energy industry is facing and what actions Edison International is taking to address those challenges?
I appreciate that, Amy, and it's great being here with you and with Ralph and Calvin. A lot of similar themes, but it may take a little bit different direction. I think we spent a lot of the time focused on climate change mitigation, and so spend a bit of time on that, but I also want to add adaptation to the discussion because we're spending time on both. One of the big thrusts we've had has been to get our arms and our heads around the issue of net zero on the mitigation side. And so shortly after I became CEO, we embarked on this journey of developing analysis that looked at the question of California, not just from the angle of us having Southern California Edison as a regulated utility in the state, but we realized that you can't solve the net zero issue economy-wide by just looking at one industry. And so the analysis we did was really cross-economy for the state. And that led to a series of white papers. We call it Pathway 2045, a lot of similar themes to what you've heard from Ralph and Calvin. But it said to us that the state can get to its net zero target of 2045. To do that will require multiple tools across the entire economy, and the electric grid is a big enabler of that. And so as a company, I think step one has been to identify the broader problem and put some texture around it. And it's been great to see that then picked up by state agencies who have been doing similar analyses with similar results, but I think we hopefully played the role of being a catalyst for that. And so, laid out that framework, and then we figured out what pieces do we need to then be the ones taking action on. So very high level, we see the path to net zero, meaning significant use of renewable resources across the state to serve 100% of retail electricity load, storage to back that up, big investment, $175 billion for renewables and storage, and another $75 billion for the wires to interconnect those across the state, not just for SCE, but across the state. Energy efficiency, to Ralph's point, you see doubling energy efficiency as feasible and needed in the state through 2045. And then you have to take all of that clean electricity and use it to electrify the heck out of the economy, right? And so it's a technical term. So that means 3/4 of passenger vehicles by 2045 and 70% of space and water heating in buildings. So that does a lot. That's a main mover. It ain't quite enough. And so you really do need all the tools in the toolbox. In addition, you need clean fuels for sectors that are hard to electrify or applications that are hard to electrify, like some of the very long haul transport or some of the high thermal energy need industrial purposes. And so there, we've been happy to partner with EPRI and with the Gas Technology Institute and a 5-year low carbon resource initiative. I think all of us are members of that. That's looking at how do you further develop those tools. You also need storage, because for California, I'm going to get the number roughly right. I see Mary Nichols can correct me very, very quickly, but let's say that California greenhouse gas emissions today are roughly in the order of, 430, 450 million tons a year. I'm not even going to look at Mary because then she'll give me that decimal point. And so we see that the most reliable and affordable path to get to net zero for the state is not to get emissions themselves fully to zero, rather to reduce them to around 100 million tons, and then use negative carbon capture for the rest of that. And so that's the broad framework. Notice that I didn't mention nuclear because in California, there's law that says we can't build any new nuclear until the federal government solves the spent fuel issue, which is its obligation under law. But when you then broaden the aperture at a national level, fully agree with Ralph, maintaining the current stock and adding new nuclear, we think is part of the tool set that's needed. That's a big framework in terms of what we do as a company, and that we then fill in the pieces that where we can be a prime mover as an electric utility. Building out the grid, investing in programs to help customers make the transition. So today we have the country's largest transportation electrification programs out of any utility. And I love it that Calvin and I get to co-chair the EEI Transportation Electrification CEO Task Force. We just proposed a building electrification program that would request almost $700 million to go install 250,000 heat pumps. And to try, those are still a little expensive. We think they're economic. The cost benefit is right around 1, but we think they are where solar was 15 years ago. So let's dedicate investment into that to help bring the cost curve down and make the next generation that much cheaper. That's climate mitigation. Unfortunately, there's a certain level of climate change that's already baked in. And all the mitigation stuff is about bending the curve, but that curve is still going to increase. And so we also think that not only we as an industry, but we as a broad economy need to accelerate our efforts around climate adaptation. A number of us are already living climate change. Ralph can tell you stories about Superstorm Sandy. We can tell you stories about wildfires. And so I think it was last week, I lose track of time, SCE filed its first climate adaptation and vulnerability assessment, actually 2 weeks ago, and last week we issued a white paper that's more friendly to broader audiences than just a regulatory filing. And it basically looks at modeling for 2030, 2050, and 2070, and it's sobering. It says that the climate change that's already baked in means that in California, we're going to see by 2050 2.6 foot average sea level rise. Yeah. We're going to see that if you look at the 1 percentile, top percentile of extreme heat, we're going to see that 7 times more often in 2050. I can go on. We're going to see floods and droughts, both of those. And so we need to, not only alone as utilities, but in partnership with communities, we need to make tough decisions about how do we plan for the longer term, how do we collaborate better, and how do we harden infrastructure. We've already begun doing that for the case of wildfire and made significant investments there, but there's more that needs to be done across a whole set of climate change issues. And I'm really pleased that EPRI is picking up that mantle at a national level with an initiative that they just launched called Climate Ready that will be addressing those questions at a national level. I think that's part of what Calvin mentioned in the partnership with Argonne as well, where I'm on the board and it's a great national lab. I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, no, I would love to just follow up on that question or your comment about the climate-related risks. And it sounds like you're addressing them as a corporation, as a utility. And how do you partner with other institutions and governments, the state of California or other states, to address those risks and so that they aren't so catastrophic to the communities?
So just really quickly, partnership is key. And again, it's one of the big takeaways from our white paper last week. Multiple levels of it. I'll start first with our peers, right? So the partnering we do through EEI is powered by associations. Use the logo, I think underneath the hat or the t-shirt or something, right? Partnering with customers is just as critical. And sometimes it's partnering through programs that we have. Sometimes it's partnering to shape those programs. So for example, when we have developed these proposals for like the transportation electrification programs that we already have approved, or for the building electrification program I mentioned, working with NGOs and with community organizations to figure out what are the needs. And I got to tell you, we got some great feedback on the way to our building electrification application that significantly changed the texture of that proposal to better fit the needs of the community, particularly from an equity perspective. A third of our residential customers qualify for low-income assistance, so it's an acute issue. Partnering with government, one more thing on customers. It's not just the regulated utility customers, but we also have Edison Energy, which is a non-utility company that provides advisory services to large corporate clients. They serve something like 22 of the Fortune 100 right now. That partnership with large commercial and industrial customers who are operating not only within a US footprint, but internationally. And so we're working with those clients in Europe, in Canada, in Mexico, increasingly in Asia. And so that's an important form of partnership. And then whipping back to where you started the question, government. The partnership with local communities, with counties, with state government, and importantly with our federal partners. I'll mention one group, the ESCC, Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council. That's the main CEO-driven vehicle for collaboration between our industry and the federal government. And it's not just the investor-owned utilities like ourselves, it's the co-ops, the rurals, the public power entities led by DOE. That's a fantastic vehicle, not only in terms of short-term response to a hurricane or a wildfire, but it's a great place to think about the longer term planning cycle and how do we get, for example, DOE to help inspire a bit greater collaboration across the 17 national labs to drive the science and technology forward.
Very, very interesting. And I want to also just say thank you to everybody for your comments and your vision and your leadership with your utilities and working within your sector. I want to ask you, how optimistic are you that utilities can achieve the transition to clean energy economy that you're envisioning? Pedro, do you want to take that first?
Highly so. And frankly, because we don't have a choice as a society, not just utilities. And when sometimes folks talk about, well, it's too expensive to make these investments, I keep coming back to, yes, that cost is high for the transition. The cost of inaction is greater. And so we need to get moving now. And we don't have all the tools we need yet, but Ralph and I are, I think, the two PhD scientists, CEOs among our group, big believer in the power of technology. And so we don't need to have all the answers today, but I'm confident that as we get to 2030, 2045, 2050, science will help bring more of the tools that we need to get there.
I agree, and I just realized why I felt so smart sitting between these two. This is really good. Yeah.
No, we're just dorky, that's all.
I would sit back and say yes, because I'm optimistic because the health of our communities. When you think of the role of the utilities in each of our jurisdictions, we're economic drivers and partners in what they do and how they do it. And if we don't address these issues, not only the economic health, but the health of our customers is also going to suffer. To Pedro's point, the cost of doing nothing or slow walking this is too high. But it has to come at a balanced approach. And I'll share with you an example of getting this. There's legislation being introduced across the country to move quicker to electrifying everything, which none of us disagree with the concept, but it's the how you do it that matters. And you have to do it in a point where it's affordable, and how we talk about it and how we engaged. So that is the part where policymakers, both at the legislative branch and the regulatory branch, need to ensure, I would ask that they ensure that the utilities are at the table as part of that discussion and see us as partners, because I think the result is so much better when it's a larger group at the table making decisions instead of one or two individuals driving an agenda.
I'm very confident as well. As I think back to the decades of climate science, the one thing that the climate science has gotten wrong has been the pace at which we've started realizing the effects of climate change. It's been much faster than many of the early predictions. So the need is huge. Quite candidly, I make a terrible impression of Mother Teresa. The more we invest in new technology, the more money our shareholders make. So there's a huge economic incentive for us to do this. Candidly, there's no shortage of entrepreneurs who are interested in doing this. I'd say the one thing we have to pay careful attention to is, on the way there, do we do it in a manner that's fairly efficient and in a manner that is fair from the point of view of when you start these industries, there are subsidies needed. How regressive versus progressive are they? Are you putting rooftop solar on the homes of people who are being subsidized by folks who don't have homes? Or are you investing in community solar instead? Are you having energy efficiency grant programs where you're handing checks to people who can afford efficient appliances and not to others who haven't? So the way in which we're going to get there, I think, can be either beautifully done or somewhat less than perfectly fairly done, but we will get there.
And for any of you, please chime in. What else can the federal government do? And I know you're working partnered with the federal government, but what else can they be doing to support your efforts and to support your programs to address this challenge?
I'd say the number one thing is to get the climate provisions of Build Back Better through.
Yeah, I agree, and it's really important to note that when you hear our industry talking about those climate provisions, it is not about our investors, it's about our customers, because those climate provisions, the tax credits, the support there, all flows straight to the customer bottom line. So it's a way for the federal government to help to amortize down the cost of the clean energy transition in the near term for our customers. And so that's powerful, that's important for building the economy. And so I agree with Ralph. I put that up there along with continued basic R&D investment in the technologies that will be needed for the clean energy transition.
And that would be my part. I think the research and development, because as we talk about driving decarbonization, I have a line of sight to 80% getting to net zero driven emissions. But it's that last 20% that is so technology dependent. And I think the government setting out a bold vision encourages that entrepreneurial and technology drive. And I would also sit back and say, I love the fact that they're bringing people to the table. Continue that dynamic of building a larger tent. Because I think with that bold vision, that collaborative approach, along with talking about not only having a decarbonized system, but a reliable, resilient system, is very important, because we can't lose that. We can talk about all these good things, but if people's lights don't come on, as Ralph said, you know, how many of you talked about saving a kilowatt, right? But if your lights didn't go on, I know where the phone calls are coming. And that's the piece we can't lose.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Ralph, Calvin, and Pedro. I really appreciate, I'm sure the audience does too, sharing your insights on the power sector's transition to net zero and how each of your companies are addressing this challenge. So please give our speakers a round of applause.